How one Montana rancher saved 80 cows buried in snow with an idea no one believed would work. The blizzard hit northern Montana with unprecedented fury. In the winter of 2018, temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees as howling winds drove snow across the plains at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. For 3 relentless days, the storm buried everything in its path under massive drifts reaching heights of 15 feet. But what happened next on John Henderson's ranch would challenge everything we know about survival against nature's harshest elements. When the skies finally cleared, John stood on his porch overlooking land that had been in his family for 4 generations and felt his heart sink into his boots. His entire herd of prize Angus cattle, 80 animals worth over $200,000 and representing his family's livelihood, had completely vanished beneath a sea of white. Not a single black hide was visible across the entire property. As the morning sun glinted off the endless expanse of snow, John faced an impossible choice that would determine not only the fate of his animals, but the future of everything he had built. Hey there, thanks for watching this incredible true story. If you're enjoying it so far, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more of these amazing stories to light. Now, back to our Montana rancher facing the impossible. The situation seemed hopeless. The nearest emergency services were stranded 50 miles away, with roads completely impassable. Cell service was down. Power lines lay crumpled under the weight of ice. John's neighbors, separated by miles of treacherous terrain, were fighting their own battles for survival. He was completely on his own. Conventional wisdom said those cattle were already dead. Even if they had somehow survived the initial burial, they would quickly suffocate under the crushing weight of packed snow or freeze to death in the sub-zero temperatures that continued to grip the region. The local extension agent later admitted he had written off the herd the moment he heard they were buried. In 20 years working with Montana ranchers, I've never seen cattle survive being buried in snow for more than a few hours, he would later tell reporters. But John Henderson wasn't ready to accept this verdict. At 62, with weathered hands and a face carved by decades of harsh Montana winters, he possessed something more valuable than equipment or manpower: intimate knowledge of his land and a desperate determination to save the animals that represented not just money, but his family's legacy. As he trudged through waist-deep snow toward his equipment shed, John remembered something his grandfather had told him decades earlier. "The land speaks to those who know how to listen," the old man had said. Now, with his entire future buried under feet of snow, John needed to listen, more carefully than ever before. The idea came to him as he surveyed his limited resources. His heavy machinery, tractors and front loaders that might have helped dig through the massive drifts, were themselves buried under collapsed equipment sheds. The few tools at his disposal seemed laughably inadequate against the immensity of the task. But staring at an old piece of equipment gathering dust in the corner of his barn, John suddenly saw possibility where others would have seen only despair. What happened over the next 72 hours would become a legend in Montana ranching communities, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. With temperatures continuing to hover well below zero and time running out, John Henderson devised a method so unorthodox that when he finally described it to rescue crews who arrived days later, they initially thought the isolation and stress had affected his mind. Yet the evidence stood before them. 78 of his 80 cattle, alive and seemingly unharmed, when all conventional wisdom said they should have been dead days earlier. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Dr. Elaine Parsons, the large animal veterinarian who examined the herd afterward. "By all rights, those animals should not have survived. What John did goes against everything we know about cattle rescue operations, but I can't argue with results." The method John developed that day would later be adopted by emergency response teams across the northern plains, potentially saving thousands of animals in subsequent winter disasters. But at that moment, standing alone in his snowbound ranch, John Henderson had no idea he was about to change ranching emergency protocols forever. John Henderson's ranch, Valley View, Angus, sprawled across 3,200 acres of rolling Montana prairie, about 40 miles east of the Rocky Mountain front. His great-grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1887, weathering droughts, the Great Depression, and countless harsh winters to build a respected cattle operation. John had modernized much of the ranch over the years, but like many Montana ranchers, he operated with minimal staff, just himself, his wife Martha, and one hired hand who was unfortunately stranded in town when the blizzard hit. The Henderson herd consisted of 80 purebred Black Angus, 76 females and 4 bulls, genetically selected over decades for their hardiness in Montana's extreme climate. These weren't just any cattle. They represented the culmination of 4 generations of careful breeding. Each animal was worth between $2,500 and $4,000, with some prize breeding stock valued much higher. Beyond their monetary value, these animals carried the genetic legacy of the Henderson family's life work. That morning, as John surveyed the disaster, his mind raced through the grim realities. Cattle can typically survive without food for several days in emergency conditions, but air, water, and protection from extreme cold are immediately critical. Under normal circumstances, cattle instinctively move to sheltered areas during storms. But the ferocity of this particular blizzard had caught even the most weather-wise Montana ranchers off guard. The National Weather Service would later classify it as a once-in-a-century weather event, a perfect storm combination of Arctic air, moisture from the Pacific, and wind patterns that created ideal conditions for catastrophic snowfall. Many ranchers lost substantial portions of their herds, with some smaller operations facing complete devastation. John's initial instinct was to start digging, but the practical impossibility quickly became apparent. With snow depths varying from 6 to 15 feet across his property and no working heavy equipment, physically excavating 80 cattle scattered across thousands of acres was simply not possible. The few shovels he had might help him reach 1 or 2 animals, but the others would be dead long before he could get to them. His next thought turned to the thermal properties of snow. While counterintuitive, snow can actually provide insulation. Animals buried in snow sometimes create small air pockets around themselves, and the surrounding snow can maintain temperatures around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, cold, but significantly warmer than the minus 40-degree air temperature outside. This knowledge gave John a sliver of hope that his cattle might have survived the initial burial, but time was still critically short. "Martha," he called out to his wife, who was struggling through the snow toward him, "get on the satellite phone and try emergency services again. Tell them we need immediate assistance, cattle burial, entire herd." Martha nodded grimly and turned back toward the house. The couple had faced hardships before: devastating droughts in the 1990s, falling beef prices, and the increasing challenge of maintaining a family ranch in an era of corporate agriculture. But nothing had prepared them for this scale of potential loss. As John considered his options, he took inventory of what was accessible: a small gas-powered generator that had survived in the basement, about 20 gallons of fuel, a length of metal irrigation pipe, an ancient but functional hairdryer that had belonged to Martha's mother, several hundred feet of electrical cord, a collection of tools, and, crucially, that peculiar piece of equipment gathering dust in his barn, a relic from his grandfather's day that most modern ranchers would have scrapped decades ago. The plan forming in John's mind seemed absurd even to him. It violated basic principles of large animal rescue and would likely earn him ridicule from fellow ranchers if it failed. But with the nearest help potentially days away and his cattle's survival window shrinking by the hour, conventional approaches were a luxury he couldn't afford. John Henderson was about to attempt something that no ranching manual had ever suggested, using a cobbled-together system of repurposed equipment and a theory based more on desperate hope than established science. But sometimes, when faced with impossible circumstances, innovation emerges from necessity. What John couldn't know at that moment was that his improvised solution would not only save his herd, but would eventually be incorporated into emergency response protocols across the American and Canadian plains. John trudged back to the equipment shed, each step requiring enormous effort through snow that reached his thighs. Inside, he found what he was looking for: an antique grain vacuum his grandfather had purchased in the 1950s. The device, originally designed to pneumatically move grain from trucks to storage bins, had been obsolete for decades. John had kept it partly out of sentimentality and partly because Montana ranchers rarely discard functional equipment, regardless of its age. The grain vacuum consisted of a powerful suction motor attached to a long, flexible metal hose, approximately 8 inches in diameter. John's grandfather had used it primarily for oat and barley handling, but John was about to repurpose it for a use its manufacturers could never have imagined. His theory was both simple and radical. If the cattle had created air pockets beneath the snow, and if he could locate even approximate positions of where the herd might be gathered, he could potentially use the grain vacuum in reverse, as a blower rather than a suction device, to force air down through the snowpack. If successful, this would accomplish two critical goals: delivering life-sustaining oxygen to any surviving animals and marking potential locations with visible disturbances in the snow surface. "It's insane enough that it might just work," John muttered to himself as he began disassembling the vacuum's intake and exhaust mechanisms to reverse its function. The modifications took nearly 2 precious hours, with John's fingers growing numb despite his heavy gloves. Finally, he had transformed the grain vacuum into a powerful snowblower ventilator hybrid. He attached it to the small generator, said a silent prayer, and pulled the starter cord. The ancient machine roared to life, belching black smoke, but producing a strong, steady stream of air from what had formerly been its intake hose. If you're watching this incredible survival story, hit that subscribe button right now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you ready to see if this rancher's crazy idea actually worked? Your support helps us share more amazing stories like this one. Now let's get back to John's desperate rescue mission. John's next challenge was determining where to begin his search. His cattle typically congregated in several locations during winter: a sheltered draw near the eastern fence line, a stand of cottonwoods along the creek, and the lee side of a small hill where he often placed hay bales. These would be his starting points. Martha emerged from the house, shaking her head. No response on the satellite phone. Lines must be down from the ice. Her eyes fell on John's modified equipment. "What in God's name is that?" "Our best hope," John replied, explaining his theory as he dragged the apparatus toward his utility ATV, thankfully stored in the attached garage and still accessible. Together they secured the modified grain vacuum to the back of the vehicle. John would drive while Martha operated the blower. The first location, the sheltered draw, yielded nothing. John drove slowly while Martha directed the blower hose into the snow at 10-foot intervals. After an hour of methodical work, they had covered the entire area with no signs of cattle below. At the cottonwood stand, they finally got their first breakthrough. About 20 minutes into their search, Martha noticed something unusual. "John, look at this!" Where she had directed the blower into the snow, a small dark patch had appeared, not immediately, but about 30 seconds after she'd moved to the next position. John cut the ATV engine, and they both watched in stunned silence. The dark patch grew larger, steam rising from it in the frigid air. Then came a sound that brought tears to Martha's eyes, the unmistakable low bellow of a cow. "They're alive," John whispered, his voice catching. "At least some of them are alive." They quickly established a new protocol. At each potential location, they would insert the blower hose into the snow, run it for 30 seconds, then move 10 feet and repeat. After covering a grid pattern, they would return to the beginning and check for emerging dark spots or sounds. The discovery energized them both. Working with renewed purpose, they moved to the hillside where John typically placed winter hay. Here, their modified system revealed something even more encouraging: multiple dark patches appearing across a wide area, suggesting a significant number of cattle might be gathered beneath. What John had stumbled upon was a phenomenon that would later interest agricultural scientists studying winter livestock survival. His cattle had indeed sought shelter in the lee of the hill before the storm's peak intensity. As the snow buried them, they had instinctively bunched together, their combined body heat creating a pocket of survivable space beneath the insulating snow. As daylight began to fade on that first critical day, John and Martha had located what appeared to be 3 separate groups of cattle beneath the snow. The largest concentration was indeed on the leeward side of the hill, where dark patches and steam vents now marked approximately 40-50 potential animal locations. A smaller group of about 15-20 seemed to be near the cottonwoods, and another 10 or so were detected in a depression near the western fence line. With temperatures dropping even further as night approached, John faced another crucial decision. Conventional wisdom would suggest attempting immediate excavation of at least some animals before darkness made work impossible, but with limited manpower and equipment, digging out even a few cattle would be an exhausting process, potentially taking hours per animal. During that time, the remaining unexcavated cattle would be without the supplemental air his makeshift system was providing. "We need to keep them all breathing first," John decided, "then figure out how to get them out." John's next innovation came from his limited but functional tool supply. Using metal irrigation pipe, he fashioned crude but effective air shafts, essentially snorkels, that could be driven through the snow to the air pockets where cattle were detected. He cut the pipe into 6-foot lengths, tapered one end of each with a grinder to create a sharp point, and drilled small holes near the pointed end to allow air passage even if the tip became clogged with snow or dirt. "Hand me that hairdryer," he told Martha, as they worked in the equipment shed. She looked puzzled but complied. John then attached the hairdryer to one of his air shafts using duct tape and electrical ties, turned it on, and watched as warm air flowed through the pipe, melting the snow around its exit holes. "That's how we'll keep the vents from freezing shut," he explained. Working through the night with only brief breaks to warm themselves, John and Martha installed over 30 air shafts at the locations where they had detected cattle. The process was grueling. Each shaft had to be physically hammered through the dense packed snow, sometimes to depths of 8 to 10 feet. On several occasions, they were rewarded with immediate lowing sounds from below as fresh air reached the trapped animals. By dawn on the second day, exhausted but encouraged, they had established what amounted to a life support system for their buried herd. The air shafts, combined with periodic use of the reversed grain vacuum to force additional air into the cavities, were keeping the cattle alive. But this was only a temporary solution. The animals had now been without water for at least 36 hours and were likely becoming severely dehydrated. John's years of experience told him that dehydration would kill his cattle before starvation became an issue. He needed to get water to them somehow and soon. But how do you deliver water through several feet of densely packed snow to animals you can't even see? The answer came from an unexpected source. While searching through storage for additional piping, John came across a cache of plastic tubing from an abandoned drip irrigation project. The tubing was narrow, only about half an inch in diameter, but flexible and available in long continuous lengths. "We can use the air shafts to locate them precisely, then run these water lines down alongside," John explained to Martha as he began cutting lengths of tubing. Using a large pot on their wood stove, they began melting snow to create lukewarm water. John added a small amount of molasses from their pantry to each batch, both to encourage the cattle to drink and to provide some desperately needed calories. The mixture was then carefully poured into a large garden sprayer, which provided just enough pressure to push the water through the long plastic tubes. Inserting a tube down alongside each established air shaft, John and Martha began the painstaking process of delivering water directly to their buried animals. It was impossible to know exactly how effective this method would be, whether all the cattle would be able to access the water, or whether some might be positioned in ways that made drinking impossible. But the occasional sucking sounds from the tubes and the responding moose provided evidence that at least some of the herd was being hydrated. "This is working," Martha said with cautious optimism as they finished setting up the 20th watering tube. "But John, we still need to get them out. They can't live under there forever." John nodded grimly. "I'm working on that part, one problem at a time." By the afternoon of the second day, John's emergency ventilation and watering system was fully established across all 3 cattle locations. The ranch had taken on a surreal appearance, with dozens of metal pipes protruding from the snowdrifts like some strange industrial art installation. Each pipe had been marked with a tall flag made from scrap cloth tied to wooden poles, both to make them visible and to prevent accidental damage as John and Martha moved around the property. The immediate survival crisis had been temporarily addressed, but the larger problem remained: how to physically extract 80 large animals from beneath massive snowdrifts without heavy equipment. The local roads remained impassable, meaning no external help would arrive anytime soon. Cell and satellite communication remained down, leaving the Hendersons completely on their own. As John contemplated the challenge, he remembered something he had observed years earlier while helping with avalanche rescue training on a neighboring ranch. The team had used warm water to rapidly melt channels through snow, creating access routes much more efficiently than digging alone could accomplish. "We need to melt them out," he told Martha as they huddled near the wood stove during a brief warming break. "Not the whole area, just tunnels big enough for them to walk through." This realization led to John's most ambitious innovation yet. In the equipment shed, he located an old irrigation pump that could be powered by his generator. With Martha's help, he connected the pump to their well and ran a series of hoses to the 3 cattle locations. At the end of each hose, He attached homemade nozzles fashioned from copper pipe fittings, designed to direct a concentrated stream of warm water into the snow. The well water, emerging from deep underground, was naturally warmer than the freezing air temperature, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't hot enough to cause thermal shock to the cattle, but was sufficient to efficiently melt snow when directed. In a concentrated stream. We'll melt vertical shafts first, then horizontal tunnels connecting them, John explained, sketching his plan in a notebook. We need to create exit paths that lead to the surface where we can reach them. The melting operation began late on the second day and continued through the night. John and Martha worked in shifts, one operating the pump system while the other rested. The process was painstakingly slow, but far more efficient than attempting to dig through the compacted snow by hand. As each vertical shaft was completed, they could hear the cattle more clearly, confirming both their locations and, miraculously, that many remained alive. By dawn on the third day, they had created access shafts to all three cattle groups and had begun the more complex process of melting horizontal tunnels. John designed these tunnels with a slight upward grade, knowing that cattle would naturally move toward openings where they could see daylight and feel fresh air. Their first success came around noon on that third day, at the smallest cattle group near the western fence line. After completing a tunnel approximately 20 feet long with a gradually rising slope, John and Martha watched in amazement as a black nose appeared at the tunnel exit, followed slowly by the head of a cow. The animal was clearly weak, but alive, its survival instinct driving it to follow the path to daylight and air. "It's working!" Martha exclaimed, tears freezing on her cheeks in the still bitter cold. "John, it's actually working." Over the next 6 hours, 9 cattle emerged from that first tunnel, all alive, though visibly dehydrated and stressed. John and Martha had prepared for this moment by creating a makeshift holding pen from portable fencing panels, where they provided the rescued animals with fresh water, hay, and mineral supplements. Encouraged by this success, they redoubled their efforts on the remaining tunnels, making modifications based on what they had learned. The tunnel gradient was steepened slightly to make the path to daylight more obvious to the cattle. They also began placing small amounts of sweet feed at the tunnel entrances, using the scent to further encourage the animals to move toward freedom. As word of the ongoing rescue effort finally reached authorities via an emergency broadcast radio that had been restored in town, local officials expressed both amazement and skepticism. The weather remained too severe for emergency personnel to reach the Henderson Ranch, but a sheriff's deputy who spoke with John via radio later admitted, "I told my colleagues it sounded like the ramblings of someone suffering from hypothermia. No way could those cattle still be alive, much less being rescued with garden hoses." Yet as the sun set on the third day, the evidence was undeniable. 35 of Henderson's cattle had already emerged from the snow, all of them alive. Dawn of the fourth day brought the first break in the weather since the blizzard had struck. Temperatures rose slightly to a balmy 10 degrees above zero, and the relentless wind finally died down. On the distant horizon, John could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles attempting to navigate the still treacherous roads toward outlying ranches. Inside the ranch house, the satellite phone crackled to life for the first time in days. A county emergency coordinator was calling to check on residents in the area. When John explained what he and Martha had accomplished, there was a long pause on the line. "You're saying you've got cattle coming out alive after being buried for 3 days?" the coordinator asked incredulously. 35 so far, John confirmed, "and we've got locations on at least 30 more." Within hours, the remarkable story of the Henderson Ranch rescue had spread throughout the regional emergency response network. By mid-morning, a Montana National Guard helicopter conducting welfare checks managed to land on a cleared section of the ranch's driveway, bringing the first outside assistance, a veterinarian, emergency supplies, and 2 additional generators. Dr. Elaine Parsons, the large animal veterinarian who arrived with the helicopter, immediately began examining the rescued cattle. Her initial assessment confirmed what John had hoped. While the animals were stressed and dehydrated, most appeared to have avoided serious frostbite or respiratory damage. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Parsons told John as she administered fluids to a particularly weak heifer. "In 20 years of large animal practice in Montana, I've never seen cattle survive these conditions for this long. Your ventilation system likely prevented carbon dioxide poisoning, which is usually what kills buried livestock even before the cold does." With additional manpower and equipment now available, the rescue operation accelerated dramatically. National Guard personnel assisted with expanding the tunnel systems, while the veterinary team focused on treating the animals as they emerged. By nightfall on the fourth day, the count of rescued cattle had reached 61. As John had suspected, the majority of his herd had instinctively gathered in groups before the storm hit, seeking shelter in the ranch's natural windbreaks. This clustering had created larger air pockets when they became buried, contributing significantly to their survival. The additional air supplied through John's makeshift ventilation system had maintained these pockets long enough for rescue. The following morning brought more emergency vehicles as roads were gradually cleared. Local news crews arrived to document what was being called the Montana Miracle. Ranchers from neighboring properties came with additional equipment and supplies, many of them implementing John's techniques to search for their own buried livestock. By mid-afternoon on the fifth day, the final tally became clear. 78 of John's 80 cattle had been rescued alive. Only 2 animals, both older cows that had apparently been separated from the main groups during the storm, were found deceased. Given the severity of the blizzard and the length of time the animals had been buried, the survival rate was nothing short of remarkable. The story quickly captured national attention. Agricultural publications sent reporters to interview John about his innovative rescue methods. The American Veterinary Medical Association expressed interest in documenting the case for future emergency response training. Representatives from cattle associations in Wyoming, the Dakotas, and even Alberta came to observe the techniques firsthand. Dr. Parsons, who stayed to monitor the herd's recovery, worked with John to document every aspect of the process for a paper she would later submit to the Journal of Veterinary Emergency and Critical Care. "What you've demonstrated here," she told John, "is that with the right interventions, the survival window for buried livestock might be much longer than previously thought. This could change emergency response protocols across the northern plains." For John and Martha Henderson, the publicity was secondary to the profound relief of saving their herd. As Martha told a reporter from the local paper, "These animals aren't just our livelihood, they're part of our family's legacy. Each one represents generations of careful breeding and selection. Losing them would have been like losing a piece of our history." John, characteristically modest, deflected praise for his innovations. "Any rancher would have done whatever it took," he insisted. "I just happened to have that old grain vacuum sitting around. Sometimes the old ways and the new ways can work together." But those who witnessed what John had accomplished knew better. His unique combination of traditional knowledge, innovative thinking, and sheer determination had achieved something previously thought impossible in ranching emergency response. In the weeks following the rescue, all 78 surviving cattle made full recoveries. Remarkably, even pregnant heifers maintained their pregnancies, with healthy calves born the following spring. Veterinarians attributed this to the relatively stable temperatures within the snow caves, while cold, the insulating properties of the snow, had maintained temperatures well above the deadly external air temperature. The long-term impact of John Henderson's innovative rescue techniques extended far beyond his own ranch. Within months, agricultural extension offices across the northern plains had incorporated his methods into their emergency response protocols. The University of Montana's Agricultural Sciences Department invited John to speak to students about his experience and the practical applications of his approach. Perhaps most significantly, the Montana Department of Emergency Services worked with John to develop what became known as the Henderson Protocol, a systematic approach to locating and extracting livestock buried in snow using minimal equipment. The protocol emphasized the importance of establishing air supply before attempting extraction, using thermal properties of water for efficient snow removal, and creating angled exit pathways that worked with, rather than against, animal instincts. Equipment manufacturers took notice as well. A company in North Dakota developed a commercial version of John's modified grain vacuum system, marketing it as the livestock emergency ventilator. Another firm created specialized meltwater nozzles designed specifically for snow tunnel creation. Both products cited the Henderson Ranch incident in their marketing materials. For the ranching community, the incident became something of a modern legend, a story told and retold at agricultural conferences and in feed store conversations across the region. It represented everything ranchers valued: resourcefulness, determination, and the deep bond between ranchers and their animals. John's reluctant celebrity status faded with time, which suited him perfectly. By the following winter, Valley View Angus Ranch had returned to normal operations, with some additional emergency preparations. John installed permanent ventilation pipes at strategic locations around the property, places where cattle naturally gathered during storms. These pipes, extending well above typical snow depths, would provide emergency air supply in future blizzards. He also upgraded his emergency power systems and established redundant communication methods. The most profound change, however, was in the neighboring ranchers' approach to winter preparedness. Many implemented variations of John's system, adapted to their specific properties. Some ranchers installed snow fencing in new configurations, designed to create snow-free areas where livestock could find refuge during storms. Others established emergency supply caches, including ventilation equipment and water delivery systems similar to what John had improvised. As for the Henderson herd, they showed no lasting trauma from their ordeal. Cattle, pragmatic creatures focused primarily on immediate needs, returned to their normal grazing and social behaviors within days of rescue. The following year's calf crop was one of the strongest in the ranch's history, with birth weights and weaning weights slightly above average for the breed. During a follow-up interview for a documentary about extreme weather survival stories, John reflected on what had driven him during those desperate days. When you're a fourth-generation rancher, you see yourself as a temporary caretaker of something bigger than yourself, he explained. Those animals and this land, they were here before me, and they'll be here after me. My job is to make sure I pass them along in good condition to whoever comes next. The documentary crew asked what advice he would give to other ranchers facing similar emergencies. John thought for a moment before answering. Listen to what the old-timers taught you, but don't be afraid to try something new when the situation calls for it. And remember that sometimes the right tool for the job might be gathering dust in the back of your barn. 5 years after the Montana miracle, John Henderson's innovative techniques had become standard content in agricultural education programs across the northern United States and Canada. His story is now featured in textbooks on large animal emergency medicine and ranching disaster response. Equipment based on his improvised systems has been credited with saving thousands of animals in subsequent winter emergencies. But on the Valley View Angus Ranch, life continues much as it has for 4 generations. John and Martha still rise before dawn to tend their cattle, still watch the western horizon for approaching weather, and still maintain that peculiar combination of independence and community that characterizes ranching life in Montana. And in the equipment shed, alongside modern emergency ventilation systems and commercial snow melting equipment, John keeps that old grain vacuum, a reminder that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and that in the harshest environments, innovation is often the most important survival skill.